and since the fall of Jerusalem to the Romans in 70 AD. There was the Va'at HaArotzes, the Council of the Lands. In English, it's often called the Council of the Four Lands, but that's not quite accurate. Sometimes it was 5, sometimes 3, depending on the latest fight. If you left the Union, you joined the Union, Brexit, Schmexit. In 1623, the Litvaks left the council and made their own council. And it's fascinating to study. The great Jewish historian himself, a victim of the Holocaust, Simon Dukov, published many council protocols he has discovered. In the Ukrainian, I'm going to exaggerate a little bit here because I'm not quite objective, but in the Ukrainian council protocols, you find how to help poor people to have a lavish wedding. It's very nice. But in the northern Pincus, it's called, the record book, you find all kinds of laws against any lavish wedding. Don't waste your money on the lavish wedding. Spend it on bringing scholars from another part of Europe to be your town rabbi and to teach Torah at a high level. And if you start reading it, it's like a national obsession. And in the 17th century, 16th century, a number of great Talmudic scholars like Mordechai Yoffe, the Levush, ended up in Grodno, the Bach, the Sirkish, were imported. And within a few generations, Lithuania started producing its own great Talmudic scholars like the Shafis. One of the most famous was Moshe Rivkis, that means son of Rivka, it's a Latin name, or known in Jewish circles as the Be'er HaGoylo. He was born in Vilna in the early 17th century, and during one of the wars here in 1655, he escaped to Amsterdam. The rich Jewish community in Amsterdam, Sephardic and Ashkenazi, were amazed. This guy knows the whole Talmud by heart. The Kol is a simple rabbi. What is this incredible now? So they gave him a very well-paid job to be the proofreader and editor of an Amsterdam edition of the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law. Being a Litvak, he was biologically incapable of doing just that. He wrote his own reply to every law in the Shulchan Aruch in his commentary, a light word, Pelish, which was called Be'er HaGoyla, the well or the fountain of the diaspora. And like all great Ashkenazi rabbis, became known by his most famous book, the Be'er HaGoyla. No one even knows it's Moshe Rivkis. It's like the Chofetz Chaim. How many people know that his family name was Bubko? The Chofetz Chaim, the book. So it's this book centered in religion. In his old age, he did. Sorry?
Not Kagan.
It was Kagan also, but Bubko had been the genuine family name, but he was the Kohen and he added. They added Kagan. They're both correct names.
But
there were many Jews with many names. But Bubko was the, and they were born in Jetel, which was not Tidran, and they moved to Radin.
Last name was given us by the Goyim, it wasn't us.
I'm sorry?
Last name was given us by the Goyim. They wanted, it was for their convenience, not for ours.
Sometimes, but it could be for ours too. That's a great question that we'll come to, but names could come from all kinds of stuff, yes. They could come from having to have records for taxes in the army, and then it could be for our convenience having another name that'll get us out of taxes in the It's the same principle, yes. But to rephrase what you just asked, excellent question, that the whole business of last names and spellings was not very important. We Kagan today, Pupkan tomorrow. In our own family, we find out that for 40 years after being Katz for hundreds of years, we were chayiv, taxing in, somebody was getting out of the army, something like that. That happened all the time. So anyway, Moshe Rivkis returns to Vilna, and at the end of his life, he wants to die in Vilna, and he's a rich man. He has all this money from Amsterdam. So what does he do? A real income. He didn't give a penny to his kids. He put it in the bank for future generations of his own family who would be certified as Talmudic geniuses by the age of 13 to have a stipend for life, to be able to study Torah and not waste their life worrying about money. And his great-great-great-great-great-grandson was the Gaon of Vilna. born in 1720, died in 1797, who never had to work because he had this family. I think it's called a trust fund today. The Gaon of Vilna himself became the symbol of Litvak Jewry. And it's not the Gaon of Vilna you often hear about in lectures and plaques, like some kind of leader of Lithuanian Jewry, or that he's some kind of figure of harmony between peoples. It's one of the most toughest, uncompromising people on the planet. Very, very tough on himself. And some of the stories are apocryphal or exaggerated, but that doesn't matter. They all go to the heart of the personality. When his sister, whom he didn't see for 40 years, came to visit him, I think she was very ill and wanted to say goodbye. She lived in what is today Belarus. He wrote a letter saying he's very sorry. He can't lose a day from studying Torah. They'll have plenty of time in the world to come. Talk about it. Now, a lot of what we know about the Gaon of Vilna is not a legend because it comes from his own pen. I'm talking about ideas now. Ideas are what are important, not whether he didn't see the sister 40 years or 30 years. When he moved to the land of Israel, I think in American English we call it dumping his wife and kids. On the way to the land of Israel, he didn't make it and came back. But he wrote the one book that we can all understand without being a textual Talmudic genius. It's called Igeres Hagro. That's, of course, the posthumous name. The epistle, the letter of the Gaon of Vilna to his family. Here are a few of the gems from the book. If you can afford a private teacher, never send your kids to school, because in school they'll be influenced by all sorts of other people. If you can afford to have your groceries delivered to your house, never go shopping. If you have the moral strength to sit home all day and study Torah, do just that and don't leave your house. If you leave your house, you'll mingle with other people. It will lead to envy of their appearance or their wealth or whatever. It will lead to lust, sexual attraction. It will lead to even worse than all of that, gossip. Without even thinking about it, 6 weeks later, you'll say that this one is bad, or it said something not true, another terrible sin. And even more amazing, if you can assemble 10 men in your own house for the minyan to pray at home, don't go to synagogue. If you go to synagogue, you'll be screwed up for all those same reasons. You'll see other people, you'll be jealous, you'll be dressing up. So this guy was a hermit. There was a Polish Christian young artist at what today is Luna University who was so fascinated by this rabbin that Jews come to see from all over the world. He doesn't leave his house to say hello to someone. So he snuck into the backyard, where sooner or later every human being has to visit the house, and he drew the face of the Gaon, and that's the only picture we have from life, a very simple and austere man, not the 19th and 20th centuries of the regular. Now, it was during the lifetime of the Gaon of Vilna that a certain movement developed in Ukraine, Hasidism. You've all seen Hasidim, the white type, unlike us Litvaks who are completely conventional looking. Now, they came up with a revolution, a spiritual revolution, that basically said spirituality and talking to God is more important than learning Torah in the academic sense. And to make a long story short, they believed in the Rebbe in a new sense of a holy man who has a direct line to God and whose children are also holy because they're his kids. To the Litvak, there was nothing more horrific. What do you mean he's holy? You become holy by a lifetime of good works of studying this. And if your kid is an idiot, he's an idiot. If he's holy, he's going to become my teacher because he's the kid of it. So the whole idea was very alien. But there were other things too. They changed the prayer book here and there to the so-called Nusach Sfar, sometimes based on the so-called Nusach Ari, but it's not. It's really Alpi Nusach Ari, but I won't get into that today. It'll be too far in rabbinic matters. They changed the slaughtering knife. Let's tell the truth. Had it stayed in Ukraine, there would have been no great dispute. This was not the age of the internet. The problem was, for the Litvaks, that some Hasidic groups were developing in the north, in what was then eastern Lithuania and what is today Belarus. The most famous we know today from a little later, Chabad Lubavitch, but in the late 18th century there were many. There was Amdor, which is today in Dura, a forgotten shtetl just south of Grodno, Lechavich, Baranovich, Slonim. They are known as the Lithuanian Hasidim, who are very much closer to Litvaks in many ways. It's like a third way. It's a compromise. They believed in learning, but in the Rebbe too, but the Rebbe had to become a scholar. And in 1771, they set up 2 synagogues here in Vilna. And that was what caused the major rift. In 1772, every real Litvak continues to be proud of this, whether or not we should be. Okay? I'm not going to be politically correct. In Chol HaMoed, Pesach 1772, the rabbis of Vilna, including the Gaon of Vilna, issued our famous Cheder, edict of excommunication. We're not allowed to marry them, to do business with them, to talk to them. They're Hasidim. Fair. Now, the accusations against these Hasidim that's in the Hebrew document are not that well known. That they engage in sexual self-stimulation during morning prayer, achieving ejaculation. It says it. That they do somersaults in the street to show their ecstasy. That they engage in homosexuality, on and on and on. And the war became very bitter. In the 1790s, dozens of Jews were killed, killing each other in Svincian, about 45 miles north of here, 50 miles. Our Jewish history is written like many small nations. You know, we're perfect, we're victims, we never did anything stupid. The Hasidic movement caused so much hysteria for one other reason. The false Messiah of Shabtai Tzvi, 1666, was still in the air generations later, when thousands of Jews left their property and stood outside waiting for Shabtai Tzvi to take them to Jerusalem. And they thought it was another Sabbatean movement of a fake Messiah. And to this day, there are Hasidic groups that talk in messianic terms of their Rebbe, the Bratslaver, but none of it really became a messianic movement in the sense of Shabtai. In the 19th century, it had calmed down because there was a new enemy, Jewish enemy. The new enemy was the Maskilim, the Enlightenment proponents, influenced by Mendelssohn's Haskalah in Germany. They started to gang up with the Tsarist authorities to modernize the Jews of Lithuania. Now, where we're 3 minutes walk down this way, you have the building of the Rabbiner Seminar, I think 1847 is it? It's built in 1847, roughly. Yeah. Think about it. The Tsar invested in this beautiful, beautiful building to make a modern yeshiva that would turn out rabbis who speak perfect Russian and would not have to resort to speaking in the ugly Yiddish dialect of the masses. It was an amazing failure. Not one shtetl in Lithuania would hire a rabbi from the cases from the cases so-called yeshiva. The most famous incident occurred the week that it opened. The government ordered the most beloved rabbi in Vilna at the time, Rabbi Yisrael Salanta, the founder of the Muslim movement, to teach very little, 1 hour a week. So Yisrael Salanta left his house, his property, everything in the middle of the night, never to return to Vilna in his life. And he wrote in one of his letters, better to die than to teach in the Tsar's yeshiva for 1 minute. So that's that Litvak strain of Eingespachtheit, Akshonis, in the belief of that traditional Orthodox. But at the same time, Vilna was becoming the center for some of the new anti-Orthodox movements, especially the Hebrew language movement. Modern Hebrew poetry was invented within 10 minutes of here by Odom HaKohen, mispronounced Adam HaKohen in some circles, Prof Dovid Katz. There was Golden, there was Levinson's son Michal. So the idea of reviving the ancient Hebrew language for poetry in Vilna The modern Hebrew novel was founded by Avraham Maku Kovna, and his works published in Vilna. The Vilna Orthodox didn't get so excited as the rabbis down south on this occasion because it was learning, it was education. The Gaon of Vilna himself dabbled in writing about astronomy, geometry, and stuff like that, even though his works there are just pretty much translations into Hebrew. In the 1890s, Vilna became one of the cradles of the Jewish socialist revolutionary movement. Many of the young men who had studied, I'm pointing there to that building that's on the corner of Zavalna and Trokagas, became the Hebrew poet's symbol of the yeshiva bocha with the huge Gemara and the little pamphlet of Marx or Engels. And in 1897, many of these guys founded the Jewish Labor Bund here, which started out as a violent revolutionary party, but became a peaceful social democratic party within a few years. An amazing woman called Esther Frumkin, born in Minsk, her original name was Malka Lipschitz, was the founder of modern Yiddish education as part of the Bund. That Yiddish, the language of the people, needs to have a school system where the children can learn every subject in their own language, in their own national culture. So Esther Frumkin and others, one of the people she influenced was Max Weinreich, the founder of Evo here, developed that whole thing. So anyhow, Lithuanian Jews after World War I suddenly found themselves split into a number of countries. For example, those in Kovna, Kaunas, were in the new Lithuanian Republic. From 1920 onward, those in Vilna were in the Polish Republic. Those in Minsk were in the Soviet Socialist Belarusian Republic. Those in Chernigov, just as much Litvaks as we are, were in the Ukrainian Republic. Those in Suwałk and Sejny and Augustov were in the Polish Republic, like the Jews of Vilna. So there was this period of differentiation, and then came the Holocaust, where in the Lithuanian Republic, it exactly had the highest record of murder of any country in Holocaust-era Europe, 96.4%, after 600 years of having the best record. So nobody understands this, how on June 23rd, 1941, nationalists who proclaimed themselves lovers of Lithuanian independence started butchering rabbis and women and babies. They didn't kill the Jewish communists because they had run away by and large with the fleeing Soviet army. And just this past week, we had our annual dispute with nationalists here who celebrate this day, the Holocaust, as the great rebellion against the Soviets. Incredible historic rubbish. The Soviets were running from Hitler's invasion, Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. They were not running from the white arm-banded Jew killers. So that is the horrific end of that 600 years of incredible relative tolerance. So at that point, I'd like to open it up to you and maybe tell some things about the community in the 17 years I've been living here. I don't know if that's of interest. Somebody wanted to know about the fist fight between the rabbis.
Dovid, there was some controversy between, I think, yourself and the government a couple of years back.
Yes.
Could you tell us about it?
All my life, I was a Yiddishist with no interest in politics. A friend of mine, Peter Jukes, a writer in London, recently sent me a video of myself, 1999, a conference about something or other, multiculturalism in Poland. And somebody asked me, why don't you talk about the Holocaust? And I answered, I never talk about the Holocaust. I talk about the pre-war Yiddish culture. That's my job. Other people talk about the Holocaust. I don't do Holocaust. Thank you. Next. Wait, is that me? That's me. So I suddenly became very involved in 2008 when police came looking for two of my closest friends, the late Rochel Margolis, who passed away last summer in Rehovot, and Fania Bratsovsky, who's from the Zwanzig, accusing them of being war criminals for having escaped the Vilna ghetto to join up with the partisans who were fighting Hitler and are heroes of the free world. So my biggest crime was to publish articles in the Jewish Chronicle in London, in the Guardian in London, in the Irish Times, and that was when my boss at Vilnius University said, "You're finished here unless we completely agree to never." I said, "That's nothing to do with my work here. I don't talk about those things at work." But I, not exactly fired, but it's the same thing. I was told I would not be renewed at the end of that 5-year period, so that gave me 2 more years to be a quote-unquote troublemaker. So I found myself being very close to older, beloved members of the Jewish community whom I had become close to in my work as a Yiddish dialectologist, taping them, asking them thousands of questions about Yiddish, their youth, their grandparents. So for me, these were dear friends. This was not some abstract academic. Suddenly, many of them who were Soviet Army veterans were being called war criminals because they fought for the Soviets. And the Soviets were the only people fighting Hitler here. So there were no American or British or Canadian or Australian troops here. That even one Jew is alive from the Lithuanian Jewry is thanks to the Soviets and the Russians. Either, if you speak to any Jew here today, either their parents, grandparents, or if they're very old, they themselves ran away to Russia the first week, the so-called flight refugees, that's the biggest group, or they escaped the ghetto to join the Soviet partisans, or they were rescued by the amazingly brave 800 or 900 Lithuanian Tzadikei Umis Ha'olam, righteous of the nations, who had to be much more brave than in many other countries. They were regarded as betraying their own people. But those people, too, were all being killed, and those who survived is only because the Soviets came and liberated them in 1944. This past year, I lost, for example, losing very many of my friends, but you can't complain to God when people in their 90s, surrounded by loved ones and good doctors, die. So it's just a little bitterness. What? He died? The late Shmuel Shrager in Kovna, he was born and grew up in Shavel, and he was a witness to the Lithuanian nationalists cutting teenage girls in half on June 23rd and 24th, 1941. The Germans put a stop to it and then organized many of the same nationalists to orderly do the killing of the entire people in an orderly way. Anyway, I always ended my interviews with the question to try to end on a higher, happier note. What was the best moment in your life? And like hundreds of other people, he said, the day the Soviet officer turned up and he said, "You're free." So that's their narrative. And that police should be coming, or that there should be intolerance to that narrative, would be a little bit like Americans saying, "I hate African Americans because they'll never think of Washington and Jefferson in exactly the same way as we whites." Of course they won't. They have a different narrative. That's what democracy is all about. Now, this dispute escalated in the following ways in the realm of ideas. And it all goes back to 2008. This was an organized campaign, not by the whole government, by a small group with a lot of money and 1 or 2 or 3 Jewish lackeys, who was a traditional court Jew figure. In 2008, you have that incident, which followed by 2 years, the start of that campaign of Yitzhak Arad being investigated for war crimes after he was tricked to join the Red Brown Commission on Nazi and Soviet crime together. But what else happened in 2008? In June, a law was passed forbidding Nazi and Soviet symbols, which sounds very nice, except that, first of all, it didn't take long before the swastika was proclaimed by the courts to be an exception, that it's a beautiful ancient Baltic symbol of the sun. Second of all, it was the neo-Nazis who, in 2008, for the first time, were given the center of Vilnius on Independence Day, on one of the 2 Independence Days, March 11th, which was heartbreaking to the old survivors who, again, were my closest friends. But on June 3rd, 2008, my friends and I, my friends that year, this is an act of God, included many of the Western ambassadors in 2007 and 2008, and I quickly got them to give awards to both women, to Fania and to Rachel. This was, of course, the first time since Soviet times that Western embassies were honoring people trashed by the state here. And so that quickly made me enemy number one. So on June 3rd, I was very involved here with the then Irish ambassador, my good friend Donald Denham, to make a banquet for Fania. We didn't know that in Prague, under the radar, no Western newspaper reported it, the Prague Declaration was being passed. The Prague Declaration, signed by a number of very famous European politicians, insists that every European mind regard Nazi and Soviet crimes as equal, insists that the textbooks of Europe be overhauled, insists on the equality of victimhood. Now, each of these points is an Orwellian trick. What equality of victimhood? To murder an entire people is not the same as sending some percent to Siberia. It's not the same. There are many different terrible crimes. And the idea that all European minds... So anyway, I found myself beginning to campaign against that, but it took a few years until I met with Danny Ben Moshe, now a professor in Melbourne, originally of London, and we handled it the Litvak way. That's not to go out and demonstrate or throw crowds, no. We answered with our own declarations. So as Shalom Aleichem would say, the mechome from the declarations. And in January 2012, the 70 Years Declaration was published. I had already been discontinued, fired for 2 years, but that made me anything worse. But the fascinating thing is that 8 very wonderful, brave Lithuanian parliamentarians signed it, led by Vytenis Andriukaitis, who is today the European Health Commissioner, Commissioner for Health of the European Union. Their careers were all wrecked within the Foreign Ministry, the Culture Ministry, history, but they continue to be able to work in health and economy and other things, but 1, 2, or 3 of them have come to bad political ends. And I also want to pay tribute to the few dozen very brave Lithuanians who have spoken up and not had an easy time with it. I mentioned to 1 or 2 of you before, twice a month when I'm in Vilnius, I turn up at the courthouse, 79A Laisvės Prospektas, to give moral support to Evaldas Balčiūnas. Who is Evaldas Balčiūnas? Nobody knows. He's a journalist in Šiauliai who cannot make peace with the fact that his city and others have street names, statues, museums, plaques dedicated to murderers of the Jewish citizens of this country. And he's written many articles. And he's being lugged into court as usual. No charges, nothing we can fight easily because they have to have a charge. Same with the partisan. I said to the prosecutor in 2008, please tell us what you're charging them so we can hire all the way up. So basically this is to deter other people from speaking up. In 2010, I'm simplifying the story, it started in 2009. In 2010, the parliament here passed a law saying that you can go to prison for 2 years if you belittle Soviet or Nazi genocide. It's worded very nicely, but what it means is that if I say, as I do, Soviet crimes were horrific, they should be investigated and the truth told, but in my opinion, they do not constitute genocide in Lithuania. There were more Lithuanians in Lithuania at the end of the Soviet period than at the beginning. End of story. It wasn't genocide. I can go to prison for 2 years here for saying that, 3 years in Hungary, 5 years in Latvia, an undetermined sentence in Estonia, and 10 years in Ukraine. Now, the West is turning a blind eye to the whole revision of the Holocaust and the history because of the current geopolitical situation, that anything that's against Russia is good. So that's a whole other aspect of it. So the war for the truth about the Holocaust in the world of ideas continues to be very burning, and it's been very painful to see Jews from different Western and other countries in the world manipulated and used as props to make kosher things like this horrific, it's the name right out of George Orwell, the International Commission for the Evaluation of the Crimes of the Nazi and Soviet occupation regimes in Lithuania. So the name I gave it in 2008 stuck, the Red-Brown Commission. The Red-Brown Commission that says red and brown is the same. And they always wheel out a Jew who says, yes, everything's the same. And there's always professors, politicians, mostly Jewish, who love the royal treatment here of royalty and prizes and beautiful girls or beautiful boys and grants and hotels and meetings with kings and prime ministers, awards and medals and so on. Sometimes there are people seeking citizenship who have been used for that. So it's been very difficult. We were all together in the Jewish community until the death of the late Shimon beloved leader of more than 20 years, standing back several years ago. So that continues. At the same time, the Jewish community here is sadly demographically declining. The real number this month, according to the Bureau of Statistics, is 2,800 Jews in Lithuania. Not the 5,000 or 4,000 someone names total. And very many are in their 70s and 80s. I personally don't believe the community will disappear. I'm a believer in small is beautiful. You can't love Yiddish and Litvaks and anything like that if you're not a Meshuggah at the start. A Brooklyn eccentric who doesn't care about success and conventional performance. On a very personal note, many of my dear friends and colleagues in 2008 explained that they can't publicly support me because they have wives or husbands and children and families and no other income. And me, as an eccentric old bachelor, I really didn't care. What? They're saying that the people who liberated Auschwitz are the same as the people who committed the murders there, and that the Jews who saved themselves are the same as the murderers because they joined the Soviet War? No, someone has to answer this stuff. And if Yad Vashem and the Holocaust Museum in Washington and the Imperial War Museum in London are all not going to answer because of politics and their respective foreign ministry, State Department, and so on, let it be. For me, it's important that there's a written record of the whole debate. And we're making the following progress. My friends and enemies alike now call me not Don Quixote, but Dovid Katz.
Oh.
Dovid Katz. And my answer is yes and no. If I think I'm going to change anything here, of course not. But we are putting into the record the truth, the second view that has been suppressed. And we have stopped the Prague Declaration from proceeding in the European Parliament and the European Union. Everyone knows it's now controversial. Our website is small and modest and has only 3 or 4 people defending history.com, but we are open.
Dovid, are you aligned with Ruta and Ephraim Zurov?
Very much. Ephraim Zurov is someone I've admired. Let me tell you how I met Ephraim Zurov. When I came to Lithuania in 1999 to take the professorship in Yiddish studies, I didn't understand why I keep getting invited to ministries and working. Who am I, some Yiddish professor? And they kept saying, I was studying Lithuanian, you's not Zurovas. You're not Zurov. So I had in my mind what they were telling me, that Ephraim Zurov is an 85-year-old, bitter Holocaust survivor, whose wife and kids and everybody were murdered, and he comes from Israel to yell at all Lithuanians and says you're murdered. So that was the image of Zurov. In the spring of 2000, I'm invited to a Yom HaAtzmaut party, and I see a middle-aged guy with a deep Brooklyn accent and a little kippah with a bobby pin, chatting to all the Lithuanian girls, having fun, laughing. I walked up to him very meekly. Excuse me, sir, are you from Brooklyn, New York? How do you do it, Ephraim Zurov? I said, no, it can't be. No. And then I started attending his press conferences, and they were amazing. One would ask, Dr. Zurov, why do you hate Lithuania so much? And he'd answer, without blinking, I don't hate Lithuania at all. If somebody is accused of killing 10,000 Lithuanian citizens, I want that person to have a fair trial in Lithuania, in a Lithuanian court, under the Lithuanian flag, by a Lithuanian judge, with the best legal defense, and in the Lithuanian language. How does that mean? Next question, the lady in brown. Zoom. So he was made into a dirty word. And that didn't happen to me until 2008, when some of the newspapers here started writing about Ephraim Katz and Dovid Zurov. So that whole narrative continue. Every year he and I go together in the frosted ice to the neo-Nazi parade in the center of Kaunas on February 16th, where it's not that they yell Juden raus, they don't. This past year they had 6 huge banners of Holocaust collaborators as their heroes in the city, Kovna, where the 30,000 Jews of the city were butchered. And the Jewish community of Kovna, Vilna, Yad Vashem, nobody dares say a word because we're in this sacred new Cold War. We're not allowed to gently criticize our allies. So it's often been Ephraim, me, and 3 or 4 other people like Evalda about you. A lot has changed since this wonderful partnership with Lita there, which has its own many issues, but they've done a terrific work by putting the book out there and getting it today.
Fantastic. May I swing just one more question?
Yeah.
Just one more question,
Sure.
and then we can open it if you don't mind. And that is the revival of Yiddish today in the world. There seems to be a major swing where young people are now becoming interested in Yiddish.
Do you want the official answer of the Yiddish professors or the truth?
The truth.
Oh, the truth. No, no! Ich kenne das Playful von dem Memme. Ich will stehen und sagen, dass sie gut und verstehen. The only way to revive any language on the planet is to create family streets and neighborhoods that speak that language all day. That's how Laser Kapellman from Luzhik, you may know him by his fake name, Eliezer Ben Dak, did it in Tel Aviv. And Yiddish never died among Hasidim and Haredim. There are today in the world 1 million Yiddish speakers of childbearing age. I spent Passover this year with a childhood friend who was born 1 week before me. We're the same age. And he has 19 kids and 120-something grandchildren who all speak only Yiddish. That's the spoken Yiddish as a living language. But something has happened among the secular modern Jews. And what has happened is that the former self-hate, disdain, prejudice, whether because of snobism, Americanism, Zionism, Hebraism, has been replaced by wistfulness, nostalgia, very often fueled by the death of a beloved parent or grandparent, part of the same movement that brings people here to their shtetl. So they buy a book about Yiddish, and then the Yiddish is, hey, there's this great revival of Yiddish. What revival? Do you know if I want to speak Yiddish in Vilnius today, someone under 21 who lives here, I am limited to the 11 kids of Rabbi Kinsey. And that's a fact. So this revival is a change of attitude that has led to many wonderful things, to book centers, to courses, to Yiddish literature being translated. It is not a revival. A language is revived when people speak it, not when people study some grammar.
So what is it? If it is not a revival, what is it?
It is a change of attitude from negative to positive, and a love of one's past, which was before negated. I can give an example, and I'll give it from the United States, okay? Until the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, Yiddish, fire. We have Hebrew, Ivrit, אני מדבר עברית, יש לנו מדינה, למה היידיש הזאת, זה נגד העליון. So, you have that whole movement of Yiddish is disgusting. We have Hebrew. Then you have the whole American economic, sociological profile, where every Yiddish-speaking immigrant, including most of the great writers of Yiddish, wanted their kids to be a doctor, a lawyer, if he's a complete moron, an accountant, speak with a Yiddish accent, whatever, treten als een met de hand, afhankelijk van de top of the Yiddish accent, he's finished. Unless he's Woody Allen or Chucky Mason. There's no hope. I was going to say Donald Trump. Bernie Sanders. We have to make up what it is. So it took 70 years for that kind of English to be okay in this harmonious American symphony of life. There were reasons that sociologists have studied. In the 1960s, after the Six-Day War, Jewish pride increased in general, and Yiddish courses started to flourish that same year, 67. Many immigrants were dying and their kids were getting sentimental. There were a few important books like Leo Raskin's The Joys of Yiddish, and a few events like Fiddler on the Roof. People saw Fiddler on the Roof. What? It's based on a Yiddish play. I thought Yiddish was just for dirty jokes. That's what our holy Israeli ambassador told me a few months ago. Yiddish, I know a joke about two schmucks who came in. So don't tell us, I like that there's thousands of writers who would be studied and cherished in any other culture. So the debate goes on, and we are very happy that there are more and more younger people with a positive attitude that's much better than a negative attitude, even if it's as often as they are revised.
David, as I explained to you before I introduced you, our group here, 85% of approximately their ancestors come from South Africa.
From Africa.
Africa.
In Yiddish we say Africa because we didn't know of any other.
I think we would be all very interested to hear some sort of theory as to why the Lithuanians ended up in South Africa.
I don't know the answer, so I'm going to quote an answer given to me by the late Professor Arthur Hertzberg, a great Jewish historian, passed away, I think, in 2006. Why was the emigration of Jews from Eastern Europe to South Africa largely one from Lithuania? He answered me, although he's a Galiciana, he said, you Litvaks don't know that we Galiciana can also answer in one sentence with a shocking answer. He's going to answer in one sentence with a shocking answer. I was used to Hertzberg giving long, beautiful lectures with a British accent he picked up in the services as a war chaplain. He said it had only to do with the boat schedules, the lines that were going from Riga and from Latvia, I forgot where, Lipaia, from the accessible ports and nothing else. Next question, Dovid? So I don't know. So that's one thing I've heard. I'm not going to defend it because I don't know anything about it. I do know that when I look at Yiddish magazines from 1890 and 1900, those coming from the Kovna area all have advertisements for ships to Africa. And those from the Vilna area have usually advertisements for ships going to New York, to London. Many were tricked. They were taken to London and told it's New York, but many. That, of course, doesn't explain. There is another theory that has to do with chance and ship routes. That is, very many of the early immigrants in each family were going to someone from their own family who went before. So after that initial 1880s, 1890s ship, whatever, route thing, then I know in my own family, our ancestor came from the village Makalashik right across the border in 1898, and then in 1903 someone came to him, in 1910 someone else came to him, in 1920 my father and his siblings came to the ones who had come just before, and a whole clan is in New York. For that, so I don't really know a better answer. In the Yiddish folklore of Vilna between the wars, Africa was especially home to Jews from the former Kovna Valley. It's not true there are Jews from Vilna in South Africa, but the majority are said to come from Kovna Gubernia. And if you look at Kovna Gubernia on the Tsarist map, the province of Kovna, it has an eastward tongue that goes all the way to Vitz, which is today in Belarus. And Vilna was, for the Vilna Jews, America and other places, England, were more popular choices, even aside from the ships, but I don't know. But the South Africans have become a wonderful shape of the tribe, and we're very happy that to be able to.
Can I ask? A lot of the Litvaks, especially those in South Africa, are very, very Tsioni. They're very Zionistic.
Yeah.
They're from, they're not from. They have this inherent, like my own family, this very inherent Zionistic, inborn feeling. How come?
In the interwar period, from roughly 1920 onward, don't forget that some of the worst fighting occurred here after 1918, Kovna and Kovna Gubernia were the strongest Jewish movements were Zionism and Hebrew. Even though everybody spoke Yiddish, the ideology was Zionism. In Vilna, Yiddishism, socialism, hereism, a whole range of movements saying we should stay here, religious and non-religious, were much stronger. It is also true that there is a correlation, but an imperfect one, between Hebrew culture and Zionism and Yiddish culture and hereism or socialism. The correlation being that most of those bilingual authors, editors, educators, teachers, actors, political leaders who ended up being Zionists by the late 19th century were derived from the Hebrew movement. And most who entered or led one of the socialist movements, there were very many. They look the same to us today, but to them they look very different. Socialism, territorialism, communism, Buddhism, anarchism, they developed Yiddish more. There were many exceptions, Borachov and the left wing labeled Zionists. But again, we come back to Kovna Gubernia and its very strong Zionist tradition. Within Lithuania, within Jewish Lithuania, it's Kovna Gubernia, not Vilna Gubernia, that had. Let me try to give a few examples. There are many cases in the 1930s of rabbis in Kovna working together. Is that for me?
Yes.
Thank you. It's laced with vodka, which is invisible. There are many cases in the 1920s and 30s in Kovna where rabbis would either tacitly or not so tacitly encourage migration to Palestine, to Israel. In Vilna, the most beloved rabbi, Chaim Ezer Grodzensky, his balcony, where he spoke for 5 minutes every Friday and the Polish police closed the street. Every Friday, he got up and said, "Folk mit den Herzen Israel bleibt so." You don't read about that in the tourist paragraph today, because it's politically correct. Don't go to the land of Israel, stay right here. If you go to the land of Israel, you'll start wearing short pants and leave Torah, and you'll fight in the swamps with the Turks and the Arabs, and when it's there, Varia was Daftidos, Vilna, center of Torah. As Chaim Ezer's students were to wistfully say decades later, he had the fortune to die in 1940 when the Soviets closed his yeshiva and didn't live till 1941 when his people were murdered. So there are those tendencies of Zionism. But of course the non-Zionists would immediately, the Litvak, forget non-Zionists, would challenge you immediately and say, "Warte minute, sagt, dass die Afrikaner seien Zionisten. A Zionist is there was kept in Tel Aviv, not in Africa." So that comes to the old Yiddish. A Zionist is there was heißt der zweiten, heißt der dritten Formen in Eretz Yisrael. But that's not fair because the Zionists won't did huge things for the country without settling there, but that would have been the repulse.
What is the email address? You mentioned the email address.
I'm so sorry.
What is the email address?
Email address.
My email, I have cards and I have many more. So I handed them out. Dovid Katz 7. There were 6 Dovid Katzes before me. So I'll leave them with our friend here and you can please take them.
Richard.
Yeah, Dovid.
Yes.
Okay. Just explain to me if you know,
Dennis.
I'm sure you do know. What happened?
Loud enough.
What happened?
You have to speak very loud, an older guy.
What happened with the Hasidic movement in Rakashik in the mid-19th century?
Rakashik became one of the few towns in independent Lithuania that was Hasidic dominated. We're lucky to have a little film, I think it's 4 minutes or 5 minutes, of Rakashik. Amazing. That even though they're not dressed like Ukrainian Hasidim, different than the Litvaks. So it was a Hasidic bastion. But we have to remember that this is 100 years after the war died down.
So prior to independence?
Also. Oh yeah, nothing to do with independence. It was there before.
It was there before?
Yeah.
Okay.
In other words, it was developed from that early 19th century rise of. I'm glad you mentioned this because I almost forgot to give you a gift. If someone can help me, there's a suspicious-looking bag which you should have reported to the police long ago. Thank you so much. What do I have to show for 25 years? This lousy map that changes every year. So this is a little gift. We're putting out a version with hundreds more shtetl. So don't be offended that your shtetl isn't here. It just means the new version will be much more dense and harder to read. But when I say 25 years, but this map are all the places I have visited since 1990, looking for the last Jewish Mohican born there or nearby. Wow. So I started that work at my first visit here when I was happily shocked to discover throughout the 1990s, whether it was Volozhin or Kletsk or Mir or Baranovich or Lita or Postev or Tzvinsyan, there was always one or two Jews in their 90s or very old who would convey the whole dialect, culture, religious and secular training. And we could talk about that a whole other evening, I hope we will one day. Just to give you one example, there's an invisible line through here of the interwar border between Poland and the Soviet Union. So for many years, we would be traveling down that border, which hasn't existed since 1939, because those in the Polish Republic had the full culture. And those in the Soviet Republic, unless they were 95 or 100, had the Soviet school. Was gedenkt ihr von der sowjetischen Schule? Gomsch! So if they were too young for me. And if somebody was 80, I would say, yes, I'm too young, I was looking for 90 and over. And my work is almost finished that way, sadly, because there are no more people. Almost no more. Never say no more. This blue line here is the best we've been able to do to reconstruct the historic, linguistic, ethnographic border between the Litvaks and the non-Litvaks, or and many other cultural things. So it's not perfect, but sometimes we were lucky when we found out the shtetl where somebody remembered the guy who had moved from the other town speaking a certain way. So this is a sort of ethnographic expedition result where you end up having so little to show in the physical sense, but we have thousands of hours of tapes. And on my personal website, overclass.net, there's the first 30 maps of our language atlas of the different parts, and corrections are always.
We'll take one last question before we wrap it up.
Rabbis.
Oh, no, anyone? One last question?
Didn't you want to know about the feast fight of the rabbis?
Oh.
You don't want to know about that.
We have plenty of that in Israel.
Huh?
Big question.
Yeah.
Is that Rabbeinu Gershon?
Yes.
He was from an Ashkenaz country, but he was from Constantinople, wasn't he?
No.
He wasn't?
He wasn't. In any case, he grew up and spent his life on the right in Lithuania. But he's got Gershon Ben Yehuda.
Just on a personal note, like, what's it like being like a Jew here in Vilna today? Like,
Jews,
how's your life?
there are very few Jews here, as I said at the outset, less than 3,000. Jews and non-Jews get along very well here. All of my problems have been with government officials and professors and historic commissions. Never have I had a problem with any local person.
Wow.
I've been treated wonderfully in the
But coming from New York, where it was like all Jewish, and then coming to
Right.
a place where you have such a lack of Jews, what's it like?
Well, first of all, for me it wasn't like that, because for about 15 of my 17 years here, most of my time with other people was spent around the Yiddish speakers who had maintained a Yiddish of a richness and depth that was far greater than many of my friends in New York or Britain. For me, it's who your friends are, and I'm very blessed with wonderful friends here, and a good life, so the problems have been over these big, important historic battles that people don't understand, that has nothing to do with daily life. I walk out in the street. When I taught I had the most boring year of my life in 98, 99 when I was a visiting professor at Yale. My mother still doesn't forgive me for the leases and coming to Vilna. My luck! They offered him 10 years at Yale. What did I do? But I lived in a bad neighborhood in New Haven, and there wasn't one day when somebody didn't yell out about that. And here, it's never happened.
Sure.
Many times when the fascists, the people I'm in combat with, meet me on the street, they shake hands, they want to take a picture with me. So a fascist in England spijt dat when a fascist in Vilna will mit ein Homa Fikua.
Are you sure?
A großen Dank, thank you very much.
Wow.
Absolutely. Okay. Just before we bench, Mariv, bus, an optional walking tour from 11 till midnight. Those who still have it in you? We have one last
Just one thing.
announcement.
The Prof will wait. Prof Dovid will wait for the questions. We just want to take 2 minutes before we conclude. And that is to say that our first family will be leaving with us tonight as the trip is coming to an end slowly. And that is that we're going to be saying farewell tonight to Jeanette Gilchrist, who is our most senior member of the family here tonight, and to Sean, and to Taryn, and to Shira. Just to say how wonderful and special it's been. You came a little bit later than when we started, but I can tell you that straight away you were right in the middle of things, and it's been tremendous to have you with us. I think that for us from Johannesburg and South Africa, we have a little bit of an inkling of an understanding as to the contribution that Sean has made to the community. I've had the privilege of working with him on a communal level for almost 2 decades now, and I think that he's a Litvaker that we're all very proud of. I know that Chief Rabbi Warren Goldstein, whose mom-in-law is here tonight, talks about a kahal mensch, a person who thinks about the community, and Sean has taken on tremendous responsibilities in the business world. He's relocated to London a few years ago, but the amount of work that he did in South Africa and continues to do in South Africa, and that he continues to do for communities all over the world, is legendary. And our broker to him is that you should see, that you should first of all have a lot of pleasure and nachas from your mother, if I can say, and your parents and your greater family. And if you can have nachas from your children and grandchildren and the whole family, and that you should see Hatzlocha with your children. I know that, thank God, they're thriving in London. So you have been a loss to South Africa. We miss you guys, but we know that you're doing well, and that you must keep commuting back to South Africa because we want you. And thank you for your contribution here tonight. And they're going to be staying on tomorrow. We're going to be moving off to Belarus tomorrow morning, but we'll call it the Melvin clan are going to go on a private tour for the next day or two. Just tomorrow, and then they'll also be returning to their homes. So it's a little bit sad because one kind of thinks that this wonderful little time that we've had together is starting to draw to a close, but we'll have lots of good memories. There's a promise that all the videos that have been taken will be edited, please God, in as short a time as possible. All the photographs are going to be uploaded onto Dropbox, and we hope to communicate by email, and most important,